After two Chinese abductees were murdered by Islamic State in Pakistan, we'll be looking at how Chinese nationals can better protect themselves and be protected in high-risk areas around the world. And as Japan once again sets a quota for hunting whales for so-called scientific research, we ask what really has to be done to protect endangered whale species. Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Two Chinese citizens who were abducted by the Islamic State group in Pakistan at the end of May were reportedly executed last week. The Chinese man and woman were working in a private school in Jinnah town near Quetta in the province of Balochistan. The Islamic State group claimed responsibility for the abduction and murder through its Amaq news agency. How serious is the terrorist situation in Pakistan? And as the abduction and murder happen in a region where there are some projects related to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, what can be done to better protect Chinese citizens who are working in the region? To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Mr. Hu Shisheng, Director of the Institute of South and Southeast Asia and Oceania Studies at the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, and by Mr. Asad Ullah Khan, a counterterrorism analyst from Islamabad, Pakistan. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Mr. Hu, we noticed that Islamic State militants have often carried out abductions of local people and foreigners on Pakistani soil, either for ransom or to get publicity for their political cause. Now, Chinese people have also been targeted occasionally, including this one. How much do we know about exactly what happened during the incident? Under what circumstances did they conduct murder?
It happened during the very fierce governmental anti-terror operation period. So the kidnapping maybe is for, of course, there's no visible organization who claimed the responsibility at the first point, and also there are no requirements from the kidnappers, but only this kind of incident had been exposed to the media after the two Chinese be kidnapped, after one very fierce operation in somewhere near Mustang, which is not far from the place where the two Chinese be kidnapped. That there are several points that, on the one hand, that the Pakistan side is already taking actions against various kinds of terrorist groups, and the terrorist groups is also on the run. Second, that it is not claimed by the IS. It is, as a matter of fact, it's the local militants who kidnapping the two Chinese, which named like the Lashkar Changui Alami, which is the local terrorist groups which were banned by the Pakistani government. And also in the past several months, the Pakistan government has undertaken very fierce fightings against those. There may be some for revenge.
Mr. Khan, from your knowledge, what you're hearing in Pakistan, what are the motivations of the militants who kidnapped these two Chinese nationals, and under what circumstances did they decide to kill them?
You know, to understand the motives of this current sad incident of kidnapping and then murder of the two Chinese citizens, I would say you will have to understand the complete landscape of militancy in Pakistan. What is happening all around, in all other provinces of Pakistan. You know, when you talk about Sindh, the problem of terrorism or militancy is more about crime. It's criminal in nature. And when you talk about the problem of militancy in Balochistan, it is more of the separatist groups that are active in Balochistan. And then we cannot ignore the involvement of the foreign elements, especially from our neighboring countries, that are destabilizing the situation. Those countries are not happy with the CPEC project, I would say, and they are sabotaging this particular project. So this move by the militants is, I would say, is to attain some specific motives and that motive seems to be to destabilize the ongoing CPAC project, which is currently progressing very effectively and very efficiently in Pakistan.
Mr. Hu, how do you look at... Mr. Hu, let me come to Mr. Hu here. How do you look at what Mr. Han just said about the CPAC projects and that some countries are trying to destabilize the region and sabotage the progress of these projects? Do you find it credible?
From this incident, we know that the IS is somewhat behind it, because that the Changi Alami has already been declared that this organization is a partner of the IS. So that is also why the IS released the video. But as a matter of fact, it's a local organizations. Of course, I also partly agree with Mr. Han, because there are some forces internationally do not want CPAC to be a successful story. So they will, if they will use some resources to disrupt or make disturbance to the CPAC.
Mr. Han, you were about to make a second point. What was your point?
Yeah, that is that the presence of direct IS in Pakistan is not yet confirmed by the authorities or the government or the military establishment of by the military establishment of Pakistan. IS is not directly present. These are the small groups, small militant groups who are just trying to get some fame, some gloriousness by using the name of IS. So they are doing their activities and they pledge their allegiance towards IS, and IS is happy to own them. So that to expand its circle, you know, the IS is a threat more than our thoughts. It is a way of life, you can say. They have teachers, they have engineers, they have doctors, they have economy. So they are there yet in the progress of expanding themselves.
I see your point.
But I would say in Pakistan, their presence directly is not yet on the ground.
I see what your point. Now, one kind of explanation, what we are seeing here on the Chinese media, is that the two Chinese and kidnapped nationals were brought to Pakistan by an unnamed South Korean national to conduct missionary work. That's according to the Chinese newspaper Global Times. It's also said that the two kidnapped were among a group of 13 Chinese nationals who were brought to the town last November to work in a private school named ARC. Now, the South Korean missionaries have been expelled by many foreign countries, including Saudi Arabia and recently by China as well. How could these, Mr. Hu, how could these young people be convinced to work in such a dangerous place without any security guarantees?
But you see, I think that...
just a moment. Sorry, I was asking this question to Mr. Hu. Mr. Hu, please.
Also, according to my knowledge, that the youngsters maybe got brainwashed by some teachers from certain kind of missionary groups, and one of the excuse for them to go to Pakistan to do the preachings is that because of the friendship between China and Pakistan. So the missionary so the person in charge of the missionary work, they just, how can I say, convincing the youngsters to go to Pakistan and saying that there was no dangers. As a matter of fact, there is dangers ahead of them, especially in the tribal regions, which the Sharia law is more prevailing than the secular law. So this kind of preaching is really put them lives in danger. But anyway, but this is not the reason for them to be kidnapped, and also not the reason for them to be killed.
Mr. Han, how do you look at this explanation from what you have learned, what you have heard? Is that what really happened as well?
Yeah, I totally agree with Mr. Hu that this should not be the reason to kidnap someone like this and then kill like this. But in this regard, the Chinese embassy here in Pakistan, they have issued some standard protocols of security for Chinese nationals. And let me tell you, the other remaining 11 Chinese nationals, they are taken out of that town from Balochistan, and they are back to the safe place. And the Chinese embassy is coordinating closely with the Pakistani authorities for the security of the Chinese national in Pakistan.
Mr. Khan, what would be the message for foreign nationals, especially Chinese nationals who are making plans to travel to Balochistan, to Pakistan? What would be the message? How safe it is there and how potentially dangerous it might be?
Let me tell you about the security arrangement that government of Pakistan is doing currently for the security of Chinese nationals. In Punjab, specifically, if I tell you, the Punjab government, they have raised a security force of 6,000 personnel, which they are planning to extend it to 10,000 security personnel, specifically for the CPAC related projects and for the security of all nationals. In Sindh government, they have around 4,000 Chinese nationals, and they have raised a force of 2,600 security personnel. Same is the case in KPK. They have raised a security force of 3,000 security personnel for the overall foreigner security. Now they're strictly, the Balochistan also thinking to raise a special security force to secure all other foreigners, because beside Chinese, they are our brothers, but all other foreigners are also important.
Yes,
their
Mr.
lives are
Han,
also important.
Yes, of course.
So we need to
secure
their lives as well.
Thank you very much for your messages. And Mr. Hu, very briefly, should the Chinese people be concerned about security along the route of the CPAC?
There it is a must to consider the security and risky before you make a trip to Pakistan. But one thing is sure, just according to Hans, that the Pakistan government pay much more attention to the security of the Chinese, especially the engineers, labor forces, workers involved in the CPAC projects. But for the individual Chinese tourists, it should be more alarming before making that kind of trip.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hu Shisheng from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, and to Mr. Asad Ullah Khan, a counter-terrorism analyst from Islamabad, Pakistan. And here is my first point. In the coming 5 years, Chinese tourists alone are expected to make some 700 million overseas visits. And with more international exchanges, that number is expected to be even higher. The question of how to remain safe is of concern for everyone. While China has been stepping up its consular services for Chinese nationals abroad, we as individual citizens need also to take responsibility for our own decisions. Whatever the motivations for our trip, if we're going to a potentially dangerous place, we need to do the necessary groundwork to make sure we will be safe. It seems to me that all of that was missing for these two young Chinese who were tragically murdered. It shows how necessary it is for people to fully prepare themselves for uncertainties of this world as more and more Chinese venture out. If that is not done both by the state and by the individuals themselves, it's a sad fact that such an unnecessary loss could well be repeated in the future. Japan is once again to embark on its annual whaling in the Northwest Pacific Ocean, according to Japan's fisheries agency this month. It plans to hunt some 304 whales annually with the purpose of scientific research. This has aroused a new outcry from around the world. How have the whales been doing since the hunt was suspended for around 2 years in 2014? What should really be done to protect the whale species? To find out more, I'm joined by Ingrid Gisquez, a global head of the Sea Change campaign at World Animal Protection from New York, and Professor Wang Hanling, director of the National Center of Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea at the China Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to both of you. Ms. Gisquez, what's the current situation about whales? Do they still fall into the category of endangered species that needs to be protected?
Whales are still a very vulnerable species at the moment because they suffer from a number of threats, including whaling, as you mentioned, but also noise pollution, lost and abandoned fishing gear, ship strikes. So there's a number of threats that our whales face in our oceans at the moment, and that's why we think action on whaling is still very important to preserve these species. Since the moratorium on whaling in 1986 brought through by the International Whaling Commission, we've definitely seen an upward trend in whaling populations, but it's still estimated that 6 out of 30 are still endangered or threatened. So I think in order to make sure that this upward trend continues, we should definitely make sure that whaling stops at this stage.
So basically, the population of whales are increasing as a fact. Now, Giscas, you participated in the UN Ocean Conference last week. The conference decided that by 2020 that it should be effectively regulated in terms of harvesting and end overfishing, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing and destructive fishing practices. How can we determine whether what Japan is planning to do is overfishing or not?
I think it's important to remember how whaling actually is done and how cruel the methods used are for animals. Whales are hunted down, and the pursuit of whales can take hours until they slow down by exhaustion, and then harpoons are used with explosives to kill the whale. So it's not really a fishing method. It's hardly ever done by one single lethal shot. At the conference last week, the UN Ocean Conference, the international community once again came together and pledged action to better protect our oceans and the life within them, including whales, but also other species. I think given the action taken by the international community, but also given outcries previously through the International Court of Justice ruling in 2014, as well as a majority vote by the International Union of Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, in 2016, it's clear that this practice clearly can't be called sustainable. Whales are very vulnerable. They are still a threatened and endangered species, and it's our duty to protect them from that suffering that whaling really is.
Yes, Mr. Wan. Now, either the Convention for the International Regulation on Whaling, or ICRW, or the International Whale Commission stands for an overall ban on whaling. I mean, the ICRW stands for sustainable use, and the IWC left room for whaling for scientific purposes. So do you think these are legal loopholes that the Japanese fishing authority is trying to use? How can one determine if Japan's whaling is for scientific or business purposes?
There are obviously legal loopholes on whaling, and it is very clear that Japan makes use of these legal loopholes for its whaling, and we know that it is very important for us to protect whales and other endangered species and protect the ocean, including the marine resources and the environment. And Japan used the scientific research purpose as an excuse to whale hunting, and at a very large scale. And obviously this is not for scientific purpose. And for instance, in 2014, Japan killed about 1,000 whales. Such a large scale is obviously not for a scientific purpose. It is obviously for commercial purpose. And in my opinion, Japan should imply there is no court of justice ruling and stop whaling in such a manner, in such a large scale.
Ms. Giscas, now you have been writing articles emphasizing other threats that whales face. For instance, from the so-called ghost gear, discarded nets that kill thousands of sea animals. How much damage has been done by the ghost gear compared to whaling by humans?
Yeah, ghost gear is definitely a significant threat for marine animals, including whales. About 640,000 tons to 800,000 tons of ghost gear enters our oceans every year, entangling whales, injuring animals, and causing immense suffering. It's hard to compare whether the suffering from ghost nets has been bigger or smaller from whaling, and I also think it's not a relevant question. I think it's important that we address both. Just to quote a local case, for example, a few months ago we saw a whale being entangled off the coast of Shenzhen in commercial fishing gear, and even though fishermen tried very hard to rescue the whale, it died eventually. So I think it is important that we are aware of the suffering both from ghost gear as well as from whaling, and that we take action on both of those threats. At the conference last week where countries came together, these threats were very much recognized, and in the call for action document, which was the outcome document of the conference, both ghost gear as other threats for whales and marine animals broadly were recognized that the international community should take action on these, and that's why we as World Animal Protection want to work together with governments on those.
Professor Wan, in 2014, as we have already heard mentioned, the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, found Japan's previous whaling program was not based on science and was therefore unlawful. Despite this, Japan resumed its summer hunting season in the Southern Ocean under a new program in 2015 and hunted 333 whales last year. So does international law show any sign of stopping Japan's whaling, and how many restrictions can the ICJ and other regulators place on Japan's whaling in the future?
Japan give whaling, although the ICJ ruling that it should stop. So we have seen that there are some limitations or restrictions on this, and I think besides the ICJ, which Japan should comply with, we should also use other international fora, for instance the United Nations, some other forums, to discuss the whaling issues and have more regulations and mechanisms to protect whales and other marine resources.
Ms. Jiskes, now according to Xinhua's research, by 2015, the average consumption of whale meat in Japan has fallen to 30 grams per year for one person, compared to around 1.5 kilos in the 1960s. Now, since the vast majority of Japanese don't eat whale meat now, why is Japan still so keen on hunting whales?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and as your question highlights, Japanese whaling is not done for subsistence purposes, and even though they use the loophole of scientific purposes, there's not really a reason to be hunting those whales anymore at the moment. We understand there's some resistance from maybe a government or a cultural point of view to keep hunting whales, but we've worked with other communities around the world to change practices such as bear dancing, bear baiting, which also often are justified by cultural practices, and change these into sustainable livelihoods. So I think countries around the world have made a change. For example, Tonga, they've stopped their whaling industry and they've now moved to more practices like ecotourism, which actually bring more value to the economy, because people want to see whales, and so I think it's important for Japan to consider maybe both conserve their whale populations,
well, there
and
are other countries,
get a greater economic benefit out of them.
Yeah, there are other countries that are also practicing hunting, especially some countries in the northern European region. For instance, Norway and Iceland are also relatively large scale, and they claim that the Arctic Ocean has many more whales than the Northwest Pacific Ocean. Professor Wan, do you think they have a convincing argument?
I don't think this is convincing, because as we know that the scientific research and surveys of the Arctic marine resources and environment is not sufficient. And it is true that we human beings have not known very much about the Arctic, including the fisheries resources. And I think in order to protect the Arctic fragile environment, including the marine resources, we should take precautionary principles and be very cautious about fishing, including whaling in the Arctic and other sea areas.
Now, Ms. Gisquez, I have 30 seconds to go, but I want to hear your take on this. I mean, the overall population of whales have been increasing, and whales are known for eating lots of fish, and especially baby fish. So if their population keeps growing, wouldn't that pose a threat to the fishery resources in many coastal countries? Very briefly, please.
No, not at all. Whales form a really important part of our ecosystem, and the whale populations, even though we've seen a slight increase, they're definitely not at the stage to where they were previously. So I think it's very important that we keep protecting whales. Science can be done without harming whales. There's no reason to kill whales at sea at this moment, and we should always continue to do that course.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingrid Gisquez, Animal Protection, and Professor Wang Hanling from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And here is my last point. Now, commercial whaling under the disguise of scientific research has been going on for over half a century. It begs the question of what still needs to be discovered. If this is just commercial whaling on the small scale under another name, then it's about time the international community called Japan to account. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook using the handle The Point with LA. It's our YouTube page by searching the keywords CGTN The Point, and you can always download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices. That's it for this edition. Thank you for watching, and you got the point.